Hi, I'm Federico. I'm a second-year student at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. I'm a scholar at the Murphy Institute. As a partnership between the Center of Catholic Studies and the School of Law, the Murphy Institute works to engage the church, the academic community, and the public in rigorous discussions that bring historical and contemporary Catholic perspectives to bear on debates about law and public policy. Our speaker, Dr. Philip Rolnick, is a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas, an adjunct at the St. Paul Seminary, and director of the Science and Theology Network. He's been a member of the Notre Dame Seminar on Human Distinctiveness and of Princeton Center for Theological Inquiry. He's an author of several books and articles, and today he will present on the French intellectual Auguste Comte and why he has become a secret ruler of our age. Please direct your questions to the Q&A function on Zoom. Dr. Rolnick will answer questions at the end. Thank you. Dr. Rolnick.
Thank you, Federico, and thanks to the Murphy Institute and to all of you who are taking time this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, to be part of this. In order to understand the conflicting ideas and ideologies of our time, in everything from the existence of God to how we should educate our children, people of Christian faith need to come to grips with how we got here. By highlighting the work of Auguste Comte and his movement known as Positivism, I want to help people of faith see the historical roots of our increasingly strident and hostile disagreements. Everyone knows, for instance, that Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche have been very influential historically. And I also want you to see that Auguste Comte has been influential and also harmful. But his influence and his harm have been stealthy. Daniel Mahoney has rightly called him one of the secret rulers of our world. This luncheon talk is designed to bring Comte's work out of the shadows and show how it has contributed to our contemporary mess. Comte was born in 1798 to Catholic royalist parents in the intellectual, social, and religious chaos of post-revolutionary France. Things really were shattered. During his lifetime, there were 9 different governments and revolutions as France's politics veered between mob rule and dictatorship, and its religious life at the same time continued to fragment. Comte believed that his philosophy, when systematically applied, would solve the problems, not just of France, but of Europe first and then of the world. Comte was very, very gifted in mathematics, so much so that he was not only admitted to the top engineering science school in France, the École Polytechnique, he was also admitted 1 or 2 years before it's normally allowed at a very young age. While he was at the École, and you can see it's on the right, you see this, its emblem, and its French inscription means "For Fatherland, Science, and Glory." While he was there, he began to conceive the role that science could play in the overall reconstruction of France and Europe. But in 1816, after he'd been there for just 2 years, he took part in a student revolution, and the school was shut down and he was expelled. There's a big disjunction between Comte's private life and his public life. He sought to establish a public harmony that was almost totally lacking in his private life. His private life was strewn with psychological difficulties and broken relationships. So after he's expelled from the École Polytechnique, he goes to work for this fellow that you see on the left here, Henri de Saint-Simon, who was very famous, and he was attempting himself to construct a utopian social reconstruction of France and Europe. Comte was his devoted student, and he lived in his home for several years. But in the pattern that would recur throughout Comte's life, they had a falling out, Comte left in great bitterness and never in following years credited Saint-Simon with any of his basic ideas in his own social work. Fellow in the center, Émile Littré, is well known to French people for this, the Littré Dictionary. He's something like the Daniel Webster of France. So he is a major figure, and he was Comte's #1 devoted follower in France and a very powerful figure in his own right and a great scholar. And on the right, you see John Stuart Mill, who was much younger than Comte, but initiated a correspondence with him. Mill was fluent in French because he was educated in Montpellier, the same town that Comte grew up in. So there's this very charming at first and beautiful friendship that arises between John Stuart Mill and Comte. And as the letters progress over the years and disagreements arise, the same pattern occurs, and they break off rather bitterly from one another. In 1826, while Comte was delivering a lecture on his new idea of positivism to many eminent scientists in France and even from Germany, Alexander von Humboldt, during the third lecture, the public lecture he was giving, he literally stopped in the middle of the lecture and could not continue. And he was hospitalized for the next 8 months in an asylum where he was treated for manic depression. Treatment was apparently unsuccessful, but to Comte's great credit, there's a lot to like in Comte. And to his great credit, he established his own personal disciplinary regime. We called it cerebral hygiene. And this kept him operating for several decades until his death in 1857. So to counteract the confusion of his time, Comte proposed a new intellectual, social, and spiritual system that would provide order and promote progress, first for Europe, then for the whole world. Calling the plan positivism, Comte held that every competent thinker agrees, as you can see here, that there can be no real knowledge except that which rests upon observed facts. Notice the emphasis on observation. And so now we're almost at a point where we can define positivism. It's both a limitation of thought, because there's many things you're not supposed to think about, and within the limitation, a constructive, i.e. positive proposal. Great Comte scholar Mary Pickering's definition is very helpful. It is, according to Pickering, the real, the useful, the certain, the precise, the relative, and the constructive. Now, Comte is known to many people as the father of sociology. For one reason, he invented the term sociology. He is the first to use that term. And he equally well called the discipline social, and significantly called it social physics, because he thought it could be treated much like physics. Social physics, or positivism, is the scientific study of society. And according to Comte, it is the highest possible form of human knowledge. Comte had a hierarchy of interwoven categories you can see here. Start at the bottom with astronomy, which was very, very fledgling at the time. Physics, chemistry, biology, and sociology ranking at the top of all these interwoven sciences. So Comte wanted sociology or social physics to have the same scientific positive character as the other sciences. One of his key ideas he took from the Marquis de Condorcet, who was one of the aristocrats during the French Revolution, who actually favored the revolution at first, but was eventually arrested. And in 1794, he died while he was in prison, either at his own hand or at the hand of others. But Condorcet said, imagine that someone from another planet came to ours and looked at us and our society. This foreign visitor would study us the same way we study the behavior of bees or beavers. And it was that fundamental idea that helped Comte greatly to develop his own system of positivism, the positivism of sociology. Well, here's a key point in Comte, and that is his starting point: the total denial that anything transcends human beings or this life. So focusing only on realities whose truth can be demonstrated, Comte coupled factual observation with an ironclad prohibition on anything alleged to be transcendent. Now, by the early 19th century, Comte's time, the denial of transcendence and the scoffing dismissal of Christianity were not unusual, but Comte went further. His destructive intent for Christianity was clear and extreme. He said, to destroy, you must replace. That became one of the guiding tenets of Comte's positivism, which he took from Louis Napoleon. So Christianity is the target to be destroyed. Positivism is the replacement. Positivism has, in fact, had an ongoing indirect success that continues surreptitiously to compete with Christianity. Comte saw that the French Revolution had shattered the old order, and not lacking in confidence, he believed that his positive philosophy and his later work, which was on positive politics, would provide a new world order, lasting peace, and unlimited progress. He claimed, and I quote, "The revolution of Western Europe will proceed in a free and systematic course towards its peaceful termination, under the direction of the true servants of humanity." And those servants would be those who adopted and implemented Comte's system of positivism. Comte thought that Western Europe simply would no longer submit to Christian views, because he thought such views were, first, unprovable, and second, completely illusory. He did not attempt a point-by-point critique against Christianity because he thought that all critical engagements like that were confined within the negative, against which the very title of positivism is intended. Comte was convinced that positivism's demonstrable results would get people to give up the old God fantasy. He unwaveringly held that theology, thinking about God, and positivist thinking are, quote, profoundly incompatible, end quote. I think he's right about that. Rather aggressively, he declared that positivism would have to take the reins from Christianity. "In the name of the past and of the future," he said, "the servants of humanity, both its philosophical and practical servants, come forward to claim as their due the general direction of this world. They exclude, once for all, from political supremacy all the different servants of God, Catholic, Protestant, or deist," end quote. Because Christians were servants of an imaginary deity, they were guilty of obstructing progress and needed to be ousted from positions of political and cultural influence. In their place, the positive movement would take on what rightly belonged to them, the, quote, general direction of this world, end quote. Well, such claims weren't uncommon in the 19th century. Marx and his communist followers made similar claims, as did Charles Fourier and his socialist followers. After the calamitous collapse of the French Revolution, intellectual leaders sensed that the momentum of centuries had been halted. The world really did see as if it was up for grabs. And Comte was one of those who stepped in and tried to grab it. One of Comte's most famous claims was, and one of his most lasting, was his so-called law of three historical states. He asserted that he discovered a great fundamental law to which the mind is subjected by a, quote, invariable necessity, end quote. In this discovery, each of our principal conceptions, each branch of our knowledge passes in succession through three theoretical states. And those states are, that you can see on your screen there, the theological or fictitious state, the metaphysical or abstract state, and the scientific or positive state. Let's take each one seriatim. First stage of history, the fiction about God. Believing in God, Comte thought, was a necessary first stage, like childhood. It was something that one has to go through, but one also has to get beyond it. This first stage asks about origins and believes in things like some being created, some person created the heavens and the earth. It asks about the ultimate purpose of life, or why things are, why we are. It asks about what's called final cause. The second stage of history, considered to be metaphysics, which Europe had just passed through, the Enlightenment, essentially. He saw this as a transitional stage. He thought it was too critical and too negative. He really didn't like it. And he thought that the Enlightenment was at least partially responsible because of its criticism for the French Revolution. But the third stage, that's the aha, the arrival, the grand arrival, positivism itself. Positivism has prohibitions and guidelines. The prohibitions: do not ask about a first cause. Don't even talk about it. Don't spend any time on it. Don't ask about a final cause. Do ask about how things work, not why, and focus on this world alone. And he believed that by doing this, the world would really come up with inevitable progress because we are focused on the real and not on fantasies. Well, every movement has its predecessors and its successors. There's several that Comte recognized. On the left of your screen, Francis Bacon is one of the first who insisted on observation and experiment. Descartes likewise did. Descartes had a mechanical view of nature. He still believed there was a first cause, whom he said was God, but Comte forgave him for that and loved his mathematical ability in things like the famous Cartesian coordinates, the X and Y axes. Galileo likewise, instead of doing a priori attempts at science, or taking Aristotelian science, he was an experimenter and observer through telescopes and the like. David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, and preferred same thing, outlawing first and last causes, but focusing on the string of phenomena. And on the far right, you see the Marquis de Condorcet, whom we mentioned just a moment ago. Under positivism, knowledge should be pursued that's relative to the social needs of human being. Well, it's tempting to think of Comte as a reductionist, but he's different in a significant way. It is true in one sense that he is a reductionist. He reduces everything to this world alone. But unlike our contemporary scientistic reductionists who think that physics is most real, and maybe chemistry and possibly biology and everything about that can and should be reduced to its lowest level, Comte opposes that kind of scientistic reductionism because it holds that the lowest level is most real. Comte goes the other direction with his ascending hierarchy. It starts with physics, astronomy and physics, moves up to chemistry, up to biology, and the peak of all knowledge is sociology, the human interaction, and the most important. Now, as part of Comte's plan for human society, he actually invented what became known as the religion of humanity. he was inspired to do so in part by meeting this remarkable woman, Clotilde de Vaux, whose brother was one of his students and devoted followers. He was completely taken with Clotilde by her kindness, by her beauty. And Comte was inspired by her to make her the patron saint of the new religion. Now, she died of tuberculosis within a year of meeting Comte, but from her and from his love of women, which was more theoretical than practical because he had a terrible marriage himself. His marriage, like all his other relationships, broke apart. But he thought that feeling must take the lead in society over science. And he thought that women were the ones who could do that men were the ones who would be the thinkers and the scientists, but women who were the spiritual center of the family, and the family was crucial to the society, and the collective human society, humanity, capital H with itself, was the highest reality. So he comes up with this religion to fuel his social dream of positivism. And he links it always, like he links everything else, to progress. He refers to humanity sometimes as the great being. The great being of humanity, the supreme being, can progress because each human being can contribute something. Progress is the idée fixe, the obsession of positivism. It's the lingering dream left over from the French Revolution that is incorporated into the heart of positivism. But the progress Comte envisioned requires loving the society, loving the highest reality of this world. And humanity, he said, is the supreme being. So Comte insists that we love and serve one another. And in his call to love and service, he says, and I quote, "Towards humanity, who is for us the only truly great being, we, the conscious elements of whom she is composed, shall henceforth direct every aspect of our life, individual or collective. Our thoughts will be devoted to the knowledge of humanity, always with a capital H, our affections to her love, our actions to her service." End quote. Now, Comte's called to love and service is really an uprooting and tampering with Jesus's second love command: love your neighbor as yourself. Having discarded the greater context of that love command, which is Jesus's first command, which is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, Comte then tried to co-opt and redirect what remained, the love of humanity. In fact, he thought the entire system of positivism rests upon the principle of love. It is the peculiar characteristic, he said, of the great being. So one of his remarkable things is he actually coined the term, invented the term altruism, taken from the Latin alter, the other of two. And he thought that altruism was absolutely essential to his social vision. So here's the motto. It's quite famous, actually, Comte's motto of the religion of humanity. Love, then, is our principle, order, our basis, and progress, our goal. It's really quite a good motto, and Comte's atheistic echo of Jesus's love commands is a neighbor to the truth, a human attempt to generate living water. There were true believers, and there still are some, who attended Comte's lectures. One, Dr. Jean-François Eugène Robinet, declared, "In those hallowed hours, that heralded such great destinies. We felt the breath of humanity. We caught a glimpse of its reality, its greatness. We bowed before it, and the holy enthusiasm of demonstrated faith was kindled forever in our hearts. And with similar exuberance, another doctor, Eugène Semery, likewise intoned, we shall convince the men, we shall persuade the women, and the day is not far off when we shall enter your forsaken temples as masters, bearing above our heads the banner of triumphant humanity. Comte and his followers were true believers, confident that the religion of humanity would replace Christianity. Now, here are some of the plans he had for the religion of humanity. In 1851, Comte declared himself the high priest of humanity, and sometimes signed off on his books and letters that way. And he predicted in one letter that he would be installed at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris by 1860. Two problems with that. First is the Catholics never agreed, and second, he died in 1857. Comte devised a new calendar in his complete revising of the human race. He came up with a new calendar with days and months named after positivist heroes. And some of them were like religious leaders from around the world. Significantly, Jesus was not named, was not included, because he said of Jesus, and I quote, that he is essentially a charlatan, end quote, and a fraud. Comte devised 9 sacraments. He was very meticulous and detailed in everything he did. He proclaimed that there would be a judgment, almost parallel to the judgment that many Christians believe there will be in the next life. But this judgment would be 7 years after death by a group of positivist priests who would review the record of life. Good people would be buried then, or their remains would be moved to public cemeteries. Extremely good people who had been servants of humanity would be buried in sacred groves. And the bad people, criminals and antisocial types, would be buried in unmarked graves. Thomas Huxley famously took a jibe at Comte's religion and called it Catholicism minus Christianity. Now, Comte's hope that the formal positivist worship of humanity would prevail over the Christian worship of God has not been realized. It's now a dust long ago dispersed. However, in one or another of its protean forms, quasi-religious devotion to exclusivist, atheist, secularist humanism has continued. Among humanists, there is a recurrent illusion that next time, if only done rightly, the Tower of Babel will be built, humanity will successfully engineer its own utopia. Comte's humanist vision was the epitome of this illusion. The term Comte liked to use for how his social reality would be governed was sociocracy. He placed so much weight on the venerated social whole that he actually endangered the value and rights of individuals, a danger that was exacerbated by Comte's reiterated claims that individuals had duties, but not rights. He made a bad matter worse in saying, as you can see here, the only real life is the collective life of the race. Individual life has no existence except as an abstraction. Now, Comte's abasement of individual life is profoundly anti-personal. It's a negative, a regressive antithesis of the eternal value with which Christianity views each human person. In Christian thought, society can be valuable, even treasured, but it is never ultimate and certainly not worshipped. Comte's autocratic sociocracy did not leave much room for social critique. This made his disaffected former admirer and friend John Stuart Mill say that Comte's religious writings about society were, quote, the completest system of spiritual and temporal despotism which ever yet emanated from a human brain. Likewise, a few decades ago, Henri de Lubac, the great French Jesuit, said, the positivist formula spells total tyranny. Comte's autocratic views have not disappeared. They are currently resurfacing in the increasingly severe and multiplying demands of political correctness. Comte's views have had a widespread influence. Many are aware of the philosophers of the Vienna Circle who were roughly in their philosophical way doing what Comte was advocating in his positivism. The English philosopher A.J. Ayer came up with what he called the verification principle, whereby he said that anything that is not capable of being verified does not count as knowledge. Comte's demand for tangible evidence has made its way into educational regimes across the world, especially in things like outcomes assessment, where everything is trying to be scientifically tabulated. In the French Third Republic from 1870 to 1940, positivism was semi-officially adopted expressly to combat Catholic education and Catholic influence in the nation's education. In Turkey, in post-World War I, Kemal Ataturk in part used positivism to help secularize his nation. Positivism had a sweeping effect through Latin America and Brazil, and it flourished as well in Europe, Great Britain, the United States, and India, all the way into the early decades of the 20th century. Generally speaking, it has contributed to the rise of atheistic alternatives to Christianity. And here you see the current flag of Brazil that still holds Comte's motto, order and progress, just to show how far his influence really has spread. And here in Rio de Janeiro, this is a photograph of a church it's a positivist church that is still operating. And it's saying at the top, and the same you see on the building here in Paris, love for our principle, order for our basis, and progress for our goal. The Comtean positivist religion of humanity motto. Well, looking at pivoting away from Comte now, Comte's starting point is far from innocent. The denial of God, the denial of all transcendence, is not a scientific starting point. It's really a kind of a faith or anti-faith starting point, but a faith that there is nothing, or nothing that we can talk about, or nothing that we can know. Eric Voegelin, the famous political philosopher, was very, very hard in his critique of Comte. He accused him of immanentizing the meaning of existence, which is a futile enterprise. And he also said of his famous law of three phases that it's no more than a piece of fallacious speculation, which interpreted itself as the discovery of an empirical law. And yet, a century after Comte's death, every French undergraduate was still being taught the law of three states. Positivism has insinuated itself into the fabric of Western thought. If we live in a divine creation, then its systematic rejection cuts us off from what matters most, from the noblest human possibility, which is relationship to God. If we do not live in a divine creation, if humanity is an accidental development in an accidental universe, then Comte's proposals for love, social harmony, and progress will never be convincing to people like Pol Pot, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Hitler, Mussolini, and leaders of drug cartels. When Comte had rejected Jesus' first love command, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, he deracinated Jesus's second love command, love your neighbor as yourself. The second love command draws its power and sustainability from the first. Once detached from loving God, loving the neighbor is demoted to being a matter of personal preference. From a Christian perspective, Comte's call for love of others and concern for the social whole, it just seems so sensible and innocent. It is at first difficult to see any objection. The profound problem, however, is not in the beneficent precipitate of Comte's thought. It is rather in the studied omission of what transcends, grounds, and actually does motivate love and service. Comte's ideas have a way of quietly occupying space previously accorded to Jesus, crowding out Jesus's transcendent original with an utterly immanental counterfeit. Well, let's some takeaways before we close. The world really was up for grabs in Comte's day. Comte was the social planner, the trained engineer, systematizer, who believed he could fix the world's mess. But I believe he only made things worse, and his teachings, known and unknown, continue to do so. Comte's meta-attack against Christianity was meant not merely to wound, but to annihilate. His intention was to render Christianity so irrelevant that no one in the future would even need to attack it. Comte did not like being classified as an atheist because he thought that atheism perpetuates fruitless questions. More radically, Comte thought that atheism tries to answer a question that should not even be asked. For Comte, we are not only to cease believing in God, but we're also to cease talking about God and even to cease thinking about God. Now, from the earliest days of Christianity, believers have often successfully engaged atheists and people of other faiths. However, it is exceedingly difficult, if not entirely futile, to engage someone whose goal is first to annihilate your faith and then to replace it so that it will never rise again. From a Christian perspective, Comte's project is far worse than atheism. When Comte rejected transcendence and teleology, when he limited universality to scientific findings, he gutted the ground upon which progress, real progress, might occur. I'm all for progress, but Comte eviscerated its possibility. Furthermore, Comte gave us a false either or, either science or faith in God, but not both. Now, this either or, this is a false dichotomy. It's a kindergarten treatment of a serious issue. In fact, one of the great challenges of our age is how we can incorporate scientific discoveries into our religious understanding. And recent discoveries like Big Bang, fine-tuning, the informatics of DNA and RNA, and even evolution have all been shown in one way or another to be highly compatible with faith, with the Judeo-Christian belief in creation. Just a few more takeaways. Comte's program has been implemented in most universities. It's well known that the demand for tangible evidence is pervasive. It's less well known, but at least as important, and possibly more so, that a vague, mushy religiosity has sprung up. That's very much like the religion of humanity. So like Comte, an increasing number of students, faculty, and administrators do not believe in God, but they still want to be nice. They want to do some good, and quote, to give something back, end quote. Very Comtean notions. But these are notions upon which the liberal arts cannot succeed. The liberal arts will either have God at the center or it will not have a center. It will be, as Jean-Francois Lyotard said, blank at the center. The absence of humility is found in much social planning. In stark contrast to Comte and some modern social planners, Christianity tells us to be careful about our projects and be careful about ourselves. Thus, Paul wrote, "There is none righteous, not even one, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Thus warned, we know that we may be wrong, even about what matters most to us. Likewise, Socrates, when he's on trial for his life in Athens, says to his executors, "I'm the wisest man in Athens, because I know that I am not wise." But what are we to make of governmental and educational leaders who do not know about or do not share the New Testament and Socratic restraint? In a godless world, there's going to be the absence of grace, because everything begins with us. Everything depends on us, and everything is determined by what we do. But the Christian view of the world is different. Virtue does not begin with us. It begins by recognizing what God has already done in giving us a universe home, giving us creation. And then it recognizes what the Son of God has done in coming to us, teaching us, giving up his life for us, and through his resurrection, leading us to the hope of eternal life. Our life plans and efforts begin not with our own strength, but with a sense of thanksgiving to God, by recognizing the massive gifts of creation in Christ, which are grace. The big picture of our lives only comes into focus in the context of eternity. Comte wanted positivism to become the global consensus. Instead, however, it's become just one more option among many. Across the spectrum of contemporary culture, disagreements now arise about whether God or humanity is the highest reality. And these disagreements have led to a broad range of unreconcilable incompatibilities. Believers and unbelievers are now working to implement opposing principles. This is not good. With diametrically opposed starting points, there are going to be heated disputes about education, politics, morality, and religion. The battle that Comte thought was over has only become more complex. And finally, in conclusion, the gospel of Christ has survived the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, 2 world wars, a Cold War, and Auguste Comte. And it will also survive our contemporary hubris, ignorance, and silliness. Yesterday, April 6th, was the great festival day of the religion of humanity. Who knew? But last Sunday was Easter Sunday, and millions, multiple millions, sang and celebrated the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Human systems come and go. Political empires come and go. But in the words of the wonderful Hebrew prophet Isaiah, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our Lord will stand forever. Well, thank you for being part of this session. And if you have questions, I hope you will submit them to Federica.
Thank you, Dr. Rolnick. First question, can you speak about how Comte's ideas have influenced educational philosophy today? I'm especially curious about how he orders sociology above the hard sciences, and how there seems to be some pushback today about understanding, especially for putting STEM focus, a lot of emphasis on STEM today.
Well, very few people would agree, other than sociologists, that sociology is the highest science. Against Comte's non-reductionist reductionism, most of the many of the philosophers and many of the scientists who are teaching in our universities they're hardcore reductionists. They believe that physics really is the reality that to which everything else should be reduced. And this higher stuff is just fluff.
Is the problem a demand for evidence, or rather the demand for certain kinds of evidence? What do you see as the role of the demand for evidence in an academic or scholarly setting?
It's very nicely put question. Yeah, evidence is always good to have. And if we had no evidence for even for God, I suppose we would have a very hard time even believing that. So the question is the kind of evidence, and is evidence limited to sense perception? Is evidence limited to testable, repeatable observation, experimentation, and comparison? So I think that question very nicely leads us to a better understanding and point about evidence.
Did Comte's altruism influence the notion of altruism more broadly, or did the term become attached to other ethical ideas or movements like modern Christianity, apart from his philosophy?
Well, certainly Comte wasn't the first person ever to behave altruistically, that's been going on for a long time. But he was the first to actually coin the term, and that term altruism has continued ever since, and it's still very, very much part of our vocabulary and our thinking, whether one is an atheist, an agnostic, or a believer of some sort.
Another one. How did Comte think that his positivism will not become reductionistic? It seems logical that the positivism or something like that will be a logical or natural result.
Well, I'm tempted to say he did have some psychological problems. Comte, he was wrong about that. He had some people thought he really was suffering from delusions of religious grandeur. I read him as being a man who really wanted goodness. He wanted love. He really did. He was starved. In some of his letters, like to John Stuart Mill, he's just starved for affection. And he confides in Mill at one point, in one of his very touching letters, about how hard it's been on him that his wife just despises him. He wants human affection. He really, really does. But so there's a tragedy there. And I think he was deluded about what was going to happen. I think more of the hardcore scientists would have just gone, so say you, Auguste.
In Here About Comte, I'm reminded of the words of Dostoevsky that he places in the mouth of one of his characters. The more I love humanity in general, the less I love man in particular. Do you see this assertion reflected in the incongruity between Comte's personal life and his aspirations? And what do you think there seems to be this inverse relationship between love in the abstract and love in the concrete?
Well, yeah, that's rich. That's really lovely. Comte wanted both. He wanted personal love and he wanted love of the whole. He was utterly sincere in asking for this. And he was utterly frustrated in the way his actual life played out. It grieved him deeply that the public harmony, love, and peace that he was calling for was not present in his own life.
How do we educate our students today on the scope and limitations of science, especially the social sciences, including the differences between is and ought?
Well, this is in a sense is the question, and we just have to do a better job in presenting our own faith. I think faith is faith in God, faith in Christ is the key, and if that's absent, how well we do won't matter that much. But if it's present, everything we do will matter a great deal. We just need to teach students to see that there is a center that is not human. And this really changes the entire interactive pattern of humanity, to know that someone transcends us.
What are good ways of helping secularists who have begun to doubt the religion of humanity, but can still not accept belief in God or the Christian faith?
Well, this is like the last question, goes right to the heart of the matter, which is we have to be the kind of people who can credibly talk about God. So I think most people who are loved and respected, first of all, if they know they're being loved and respected, even in a disagreement, will continue to listen. So it's really a quality of receiving the love of God, and then really and truly respecting and listening to others as we do attempt to help them come either to God for the first time or back to God.
How did Comte reconcile his claim to offer a scientific account of the world with his appeal to feeling?
Well, he thought that feelings were part of the human social reality. And rightly or wrongly, he associated that with women. And so he was very much a man of the 19th century in that sense. Feminists would be screaming at him. And even John Stuart Mill was quite upset with him with his attitude about women. So Comte actually thought that women should stay home and they should not work, that they should stay home and that they should be the loving, wonderful centers of family life, and that families then would be the cellular system of the civilization and so forth. So he had a rather traditionalist sense of this. And again, I think he was utterly sincere. He knew that he didn't have it in his own life. He wanted it. He desperately wanted it, and he wanted it for others.
If you're familiar with Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of Protestant liberal theology, do you see any influence from him upon Comte's religion of humanity?
Well, I am familiar with the German Schleiermacher, but not sure what that would be. Schleiermacher did, I suppose, in his emphasis on feeling, Schleiermacher said that all of our religious concepts should be tested by what he called das Gefühl, the feeling, the sense of the presence of God. And if it didn't square with this inner religious feeling, then we should chuck the doctrine. So perhaps in that sense, that must be what your questioner, that's actually a very interesting link. It's very good.
Under positivism, where does testimony fall? Can you prove anything by testimony?
Oh, well, I suppose it depends what you're testifying about. If you're testifying about God or resurrection or something like that, your testimony would be a priori ruled out. If you're giving testimony about some scientific matter, your testimony would be taken seriously, or at least seriously enough to try it ourselves. But it would have to be repeatable and demonstrable to others as well.
And this is a personal question. Is there a relationship between his positivism with what is known as legal positivism?
Quite possibly, but that I can't say with any expertise on that. Perhaps there is a relationship between the positivism. I think that Pickering does think there is some relation like that between the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, where it's built up on case law, and that one always looks at precedents and so forth as a kind of perhaps it's a kind of a positivism of the law that doesn't recognize what Catholics would call natural law.
Was he familiar at all with classical and or medieval metaphysics and arguments for the existence of God? Or did he just simply not believe in God or thought it as a matter of blind faith?
Well, he was raised as a Catholic, so he did until about the age of 12 or 13, he was being catechized in his home. And he quite shocked his parents when he told them that he no longer believed any of that at a very early age. I believe he was about 13 when he said it. So he does have a familiarity with it, but people like Henri de Lubac think that his understanding was like really, really poor of almost everything in Christian doctrine.
Mahoney characterizes the system as leading to self-deification. Does the term deification feature in Comte's own work? If so, what did he mean by the term deification of humanity?
Right. Well, now let's remember that Comte's deification is the deification of humanity as a whole, never of just one individual person. I think a degeneration of Comte's thinking would be the tendency to self-deify of other atheists who just say, well, let's skip the humanity as a whole and let's just talk about me.
Well, that's our time. Thank you, Dr. Rolnick, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a nice day.